It's a new year and a new chance for you to make a fresh start with your compliance. We're going to be bringing you a daily tip, strategy, or idea that you can use to improve your program. Here's your host, Tom Fox, the Compliance Evangelist.
Welcome to 31 Days to a More Effective Compliance Program for the month of January 2023. In this podcast series, I will post a key best practice for a compliance program each day. By the end of January, you will have enough information to create, design, and implement a best practices compliance program. Each podcast is relatively short at 6 to 8 minutes with 3 key takeaways that you can implement at little or no cost. Today, we begin with what 2022 brought to compliance. The year was very significant for every compliance practitioner and compliance program. While there was a paucity of corporate FCPA enforcement actions, there were 3 enforcement actions which I believe were significant with multiple lessons for the compliance professional. In ABB, we learned the cost of a corrupt culture and recidivism. In Glencore, we saw what happens to a company which engages in a worldwide systematic plan or scheme of bribery and corruption. In Stericycle, we had a company whose culture was so corrupt and it was burned into the DNA of the LATAM business unit that it was documented through spreadsheets and analysis of revenue based on the payment of bribes. Yet, even with this corporate culture, Stericycle was able to take advantage of discounts available under the FCPA corporate enforcement policy and receive a 25% reduction off the bottom of the applicable U.S. sentencing guidelines. September saw the announcement of a significant refinement of the DOJ enforcement policies around the FCPA and information on corporate enforcement programs. It was encapsulated in a Monaco Memo and a speech by Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco announcing the Monaco Doctrine. There were also additional complementary commentaries by Principal Associate Deputy Attorney General Marshall Miller and a speech by Assistant Attorney General Kenneth. Every compliance professional should study all of them in detail as they significantly turn up the heat on corporate compliance programs. The Monaco Memo is broken down into 4 main sections. Number 1, guidance on individual accountability. Number 2, guidance on corporate accountability. Number 3, independent compliance monitorships. And number 4, commitment to transparency in corporate enforcement. The Monaco Memo is both further clarification and further guidance for line prosecutors when they are considering whether to put a monitor in place. While many of these factors are quite interesting, there have really not provided any new additional information until this memo. While we've seen these factors, here they are in writing. Perhaps the greatest significance is that the Monaco Memo sets down all of these matters in writing, which leads to a blueprint for DOJ thinking and a roadmap for anyone who finds himself in an FCPA investigation or enforcement action. I see the Monaco Memo and Miller and Polite speeches as complementary releases of information which drive home several key changes in DOJ enforcements. Perhaps changes are too strong, but they are announcements that make clear the DOJ is dedicated to individual accountability and prosecution. Corporations will have to reorient their approach to investigations and sharing of information with the DOJ under this new mandate. The DOJ is strongly shifting the burden in investigatory and negotiation phases to make clear companies must come forward with evidence to support lower fines and penalties and greater discounts, particularly in individual financial penalties and incentives, i.e. clawbacks. The Monaco Memo laid out not simply how to avoid a monitor, but a program of proactive monitoring which can lead to a prevention of a crime before there is an FCPA violation. Finally, the Monaco Memo submitted the new DOJ requirement for CCO certification of compliance programs at the time of end of resolution. The final key event for compliance in 2022 was very much under the radar. It was the DOJ hiring of Matt Galvan to help develop a data analytics expertise and capability for the FCPA unit and fraud section. Galvan was most recently the CCO at AB InBev and perhaps the top compliance professional in the use of data analytics for a corporate compliance program. It will be most interesting to see where Galvan and the DOJ take this initiative, but it does portend the increasing use of data analytics in FCPA enforcement and compliance. We're going to have a quick word from our sponsor, and we'll be right back with today's 3 key takeaways. So what are today's 3 key takeaways? Number 1, although there were a lesser amount of FCPA enforcement actions, they were significant in communicating information to the compliance professional. Number 2, the Monaco Memo was a jolt for compliance and requires compliance professionals to really up their game in terms of their corporate culture, their compliance program, and their investigative practices. It also laid out how the DOJ will think through the monitorship issue. Finally, and cementing in place something that occurred earlier in the year, CCO certification is now mandated for every compliance settlement, or rather FCPA enforcement action, which is settled. And so this is going to put a lot more pressure on compliance programs. And the third final takeaway is one that was a bit under the radar, but I think at the end of the day may be as significant as the first 2 for this episode of Day 1. And that's the DOJ hiring of Matt Galvan. Matt Galvan was the CCO at AB InBev, who, as a result of an FCPA enforcement action, developed perhaps the top corporate data analytics program in compliance in the United States and literally across the globe. Matt's been hired by the FCPA, or rather DOJ fraud section, to help develop data analytics expertise within the fraud section and the FCPA unit, and also build out capabilities for those groups in enforcement actions. I hope you will join me tomorrow for Day 2 in 31 Days to a More Effective Compliance Program, where I take up continuous monitoring leading to continuous improvement. If you'd like information on any of the topics from this podcast series, please check out the Compliance Handbook 3rd edition, available at lexisnexis.com/Fox. This is Tom Fox again. Thank you for listening to this episode of 31 Days to a More Effective Compliance Program. I hope you will join me for the entire month of January, where I take a look at some of the significant changes in compliance and FCPA enforcement. 31 Days to a More Effective Compliance Program is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.